Oh, well, alright, let's go ahead and get started. It looks like my camera is misaligned, but we'll leave it as is for right now. I think you can all imagine that I have a forehead and hair, so. All right, let's go ahead and get started. And everybody go ahead and say that you're here in chat. All right, that's 11, so we're all here. Looks good. So I wanted to go ahead and cover what we had talked about in more detail. What would this be? Last Thursday. And this is a perfect example of why when you're ill, you shouldn't be trying to work, because painfully obvious things in programming land, and this is the exact copy of what we did before, will be much more difficult for you. So, trying to be lazy, I went ahead and did the following. I created an enemy class, and then what I was thinking was overriding these values, HP, and setting them to 7, 10, etc. But I forgot the fact that what I'm doing when I refer to as an enemy, let's see, where am I? Here, enemy dot get IP, or get the I and calling HP, is I'm calling this HP here inside enemy, not the HP that was overloaded in, say, the example of cat. So we come down here and we run it. The first 5 are robots. Come down here. And we notice I fixed the constructor for robot. Now it calls the super constructor for enemy, sets the HP to 20, the attack to 4, and moves speed to 1. So it sets these values to the values that I'm setting, not creating a local instance. Or, yeah, you could think of them as local. I don't think that's the right term, but a value inside this class cat that's happens to also be called HP. Does that make sense? And that's why robot shows up with 20 here. And the other example, I believe, would be robot dog. Robot dog shows up here with 0, because I'm actually never setting this HP as a separate HP from the parent class's HP. Does that make sense? Does anybody not understand that? I think it's pretty straightforward. And as soon as I sat down and thought about it, I'm like, oh, that's painfully obvious. Yeah, that was silly on my behalf. And so that's why I did show you just after class. I posted this here, which was an example of robot with a constructor, a default constructor with no parameters that sets these values the way you should actually do it. So my mistake was trying to be fast and lazy, and then forgetting the nuance of these are variables inside the class cat, not affecting the ones from enemy. And I'll show you some more nuance to that here later. But I'll show you how you fix this. Public cat super, which calls the parent class's instance of this method. And in this case, you call super inside a constructor. It calls the same constructor that matches the parameter arguments. Now, notice there's no parameters here, so therefore it's calling enemy with no parameters, which therefore calls object with no parameter. But in this case, we're more concerned with enemies. And we can just do the same here. 7, make that 1, make that 5, and then just delete these. We don't need them. Same here. Make this robot dog. 10, 3, 3. Delete this. Run this. It was 10s or 20 zeros. Now it's 20 10. So it works the way it should, and that's why I was like, this is just when I was even doing it last Thursday. I was like, I know there's something obviously wrong here. I'm just forgetting it, and I'm just skipping over it, and that was the issue. So we have the enemy factory here, and this is what I started to get towards last Thursday also. And so what we can do is we'll comment these out. I decided to go ahead and comment stuff out instead of deleting it. That way, when I post the code, it will still be there, and you can still, therefore, uncomment it. So let's see. Enemy factory make robot class. Oh, yeah, we have it here. So robot.class. Let me show you exactly what that actually prints out. My class $robot. Not something you're going to do all the time, but might be useful in debugging. And what that means is my class, the parent class, and then the $sign means an anonymous or a inner class robot. And honestly, I forget what they do. For anonymous inner classes, but we'll get to that later. I'll cover that in more detail later, so don't worry about that. You run into anonymous inner classes a lot when you start doing UI-based work. Click listeners in Android, where you click something and it detects your finger press. That's you create a new click listener, but instead of going through the process of saying all of this and then putting your logic in here on the on click method, all you do is there's a shorthand way of basically you don't have to declare this outside the class. You can basically just, this is pseudocode, so don't I'll show you in the future how to do this shorthand through lambdas, but that's not how you do it now without learning. You would actually use Android's logging there. But this is what you would do, is you would get the view, you would set the on-click listener, and you would create a new instance of this class that extends this one method. Does that make sense? And so this is what we call an anonymous inner class, because it's anonymous and it's inside another class. Pretty straightforward. I mean, computer science people aren't the most original when it comes to naming. You don't need to know that offhand right now, but since I mentioned it in an aside, I figured I would talk about it. the other nice thing about doing this, knowing the class, you can get simple name. I think that's the syntax. Yeah. So simple name will give you the name of the class by itself. That's real. I use that a ton in logging, and it's really useful for debugging. In particular, when you're working in concurrency or distributed systems, logging like this through to the command line or through a logging system is sometimes literally the only way you can test things. So there's more advanced debugging capabilities that we'll get to when we get to Android Studio proper, but that's not always the most elegant solution. And if it, so, I won't say it's impossible under all conditions, but there's some conditions where it's just a lot easier to print out command or statements to the command line. So being able to say this, test out so you see there's the word robot there, and we could filter the output to find only the lines with the word robot there. Does that make sense? Why you would want to know these things on how to output them like this? Oh, you can't see the result window. Of course. There we go. I apologize. There you go. Yeah, you can see it now. I'm gonna have to figure out why it's cropping the window weird. Huh. It shouldn't be. Oh, you know what? That might help. Yeah, that's good enough. There's a little black outline, but you can see the exact window I'm seeing. I'm going to have to remember that the scaling doesn't work quite right for an individual window like it does a full window. My desktop is running at 1440p, not 1080p, but the stream I'm sending is 1080p. That's the root cause of this. So, and I don't want it to stretch the fonts and make it so like the letters are wider. It gets really ugly when that happens sometimes. So, does everybody understand the concept of the default constructor overriding the parameters? Now, what we could do is in here in robot have public int my special value equals there. And only instances of robot or any class that extends robot would have access to this. So if you have a cat and you try to access this, it would give you a runtime error. So it's even giving compile time. So there you go. Enemies. Oh yeah, because I made an array list of enemy. I could do this. And this is called casting. I think at the compile time this will work fine. Did I leave an asterisk? Syntax might be biting me. Oh, robot. That's why. Not... Yeah, it just doesn't like the syntax of that, which is fine. I knew it was going to error. I just wasn't sure where or how, in what way. Oh. There we go. Yeah, there we go. There's the actual runtime exception. Robot dog, robot, or my class robot dog cannot be cast to class my class robot. So, I think does that make sense? How even if you try to force it, you can't access a variable that exists in a class that what you're looking at isn't a type of. Does that make sense? Any questions about that? Okay. Oh, I might have a question. Notice the first 5 I think the first 5 were robots. Only when it got down to robot dog here did it error. So the first 5 entries and enemies were actually instances of robot, and then the robot down here or the enemy was a robot dog. And so when it got through this list, well, 5 to 10, all of them would have been robot dogs, not robots. It can be a little confusing. It's just you have to keep track of what you're actually looking at. And if you're trying to access a method that doesn't exist in the class you're casting to, it can cause runtime exceptions. That's why casting like this shouldn't be done if at all possible. There are some cases where it's much easier to cast, but that'll I'll show you some examples of that. Generally, that's a sign of the need to refactor your code into a better system. All right, so what do we want? Let's clean this up. Get rid of this. Okay, and so are we clear on the idea of a factory versus an abstract factory? Factory just calls make robot, make cat, make robot dog, etc., specifying exactly what it's wanting to return. Whereas, and these can be complex. They don't have to be exactly one-liners. It could be doing a bunch of work and then returning an object. And then abstract factory, the way I like to think of it is just using some type of string, or unique value to tell me or tell the code what type of object to create. In this case, we're just using class type because that's unique. So hopefully that clears up any of the questions regarding basic inheritance, some levels of polymorphism where you're storing robot and robot dog into the enemy's array list, which is an enemy. And then we're making use of, let's get rid of this, and HP. If you run this, it should run properly. There we go. So this is the basic concepts of a lot of design patterns. There's always some cost-benefit trade-off going on. when you're using the factory or you're using abstract factory, like here's a good example. Public static int enemy unique ID equals 1. Let's show you multiple constructors like we've done before. And call it UID. Oops. Remember, capitalization matters for variables. So, lowercase I. Such a habit of hitting Control S. Lowercase I versus uppercase I would make a difference. Technically, code will compile if you don't have end-line markers like this. Doesn't look good. It's bad programming style, but technically it'll work. But as a developer, you're going to want to avoid that. Because just look at, when you're looking through the code, you have all of these in order, except over here they're out by themselves. Like, it bothers me even just leaving them there to talk about. So, let's execute this, see if it works. Doesn't work. Because I put this in the wrong spot. Okay. Execute this. And you notice the unique ID goes up by 1 for each one of the variables. So, let's do the full range. And why does it start at 5? Because we come up here and we create new. 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah. So it starts at 1, makes it 2, 3, 4, and then the first one starts at 5. Because we come down here, even when we're using the abstract method, we're calling the enemy factory method make robot. Does that make sense? So you can do things in these factory methods that they're not just having be one-liners. You could have a unique ID, something you'll run into in the future is called a UUID. But for right now, we'll just count them as counting up from 0 as unique IDs. Does that make sense? Any questions? Okay. So something else I wanted to talk about, I had some questions from students who wanted more exercises to work on, additional things to learn on your own in addition to what we're covering in class. I'll go ahead and start thinking about the assignments. I think the first one's supposed to be this week. I'll check to make sure. But I wanted to show you this website. There's a couple of these websites: HackerRank, LeetCode. They're all good in their own right and all have issues. I found problems with HackerRank, in particular running Java. The sample code they give you isn't good, to be honest, in a lot of instances. And the VMs or virtual machines they use to test your code are, I think, misconfigured in a couple of cases. But that's regardless. Every site's going to have some bugs like that when it's trying to do such complex things. So this is another site where you can go ahead and log in or sign up, enter your information. I'm going to go ahead and log in myself and not show you that process, just so email and everything isn't exposed. I've done a bunch of the problem-solving questions previously. I think I did a bunch of these back in like March and April. But you'll notice they have names, they have difficulties. If you stick to easy, I will load the solved and unsolved. And I guess warm up. These warm up ones are going to be really good problems for you guys or you all to get your feet wet, I guess. So let's start here. These are like programming problem type of questions. Nowadays, I would highly recommend you have an account on here and LeetCode at least, and maybe some others. Get used to using these types of systems, because you can see here you can pick different languages. And what they'll do is they'll have a well, let's just do this. Turn A plus B. Come down here, run the code. Similar to the JDoodle that we were using previously, but this has multiple test cases. And then when you submit the code, you will get evaluated against a bunch of submissions. Like here, 5 months ago, I submitted my example, and it worked. Then you can see leaderboards. There's discussions. Now, in the discussion of most problems, you can get the answer to the question in almost every public question. However, I highly recommend you don't use those first, but instead try to solve it yourself. And then only after you can't solve it. Oh yeah, this isn't a good one. Here's a good one. Medium. I've only solved a couple of these. Come here, and then you'll see actual code examples that solve them. This one's in C++. Yeah, this is a much more hands-on, but I'm afraid that, especially with HackerRank, the questions become obtuse, and literally you don't know what they're asking for, especially with advanced topics like sorting and graphs and stuff like that. They'll want you to use to count the number of, what's a good example? Count the number of moves that a bubble sort will use if you ran it, or calculate the number of moves a bubble sort would use. But you can't run a bubble sort because a bubble sort itself is too inefficient. Sorry, message. So you can't actually run the algorithm to calculate and count how many moves it takes. So it requires knowing offhand, and there's no hint of this in the question, that you need to use the binary index tree and I think that was the solution, and basically modify that algorithm and run it. And there's no hint whatsoever in this text here that that's the way you should solve it. And so I don't think those are super useful to anybody, honestly, other than highly experienced developers who probably already knew that from somewhere or are just learning how to solve these problems for basically interviews. And in that case, I still don't think that's a highly effective educational methodology. So if you get stuck, it's not a problem to look at the discussion, but don't copy and paste the code. That's the key. Particularly, look at another programming language's solution. That's what I've tried to always do. And see what approach are they taking. Because even if you are doing the right approach, then if you're slightly less efficient, then generally you'll see the I think this is the one where I'm going back and forth between Java 7 and Java 8. This is the one where the Java 8 virtual machine was counting wrong. Perfect example. So and they have a bunch of test cases that you can look at and whatnot. So, and then you can unlock these by getting hackaroos, I think they call them. I don't know, some currency. But just so you know, this is a really nice additional methodology for self-practice with these types of things. And then, like I said, purposely don't look at the solution until you've tried it. I won't be requiring you to use any of these, but at least not now. Maybe one or two in the semester, just but we'll see about that. But I just wanted to discuss that. It had been asked as a question. So we've talked about any questions so far about any of the coding stuff that we've talked about, or HackerRank or anything like that? Unfortunately, asking questions in class is still much faster in person, but this is working all right. Question asked is, besides the two that I mentioned, are there any other coding sites that you would recommend? Offhand, no. There are, well, yes, let me rephrase that. For web development, the W3 Schools is hands down the best resource I've ever found. There's a couple books, and I linked one of them, PHP and MySQL Development. I think it was volume 3 that I learned off of that covered PHP 3, and then or maybe it was 4, and then it was talking about PHP 3 and PHP 4. PHP is a web-based programming language. That's one of the few books I ever found that was actually useful for it, but in particular, it is excellent at teaching basic SQL understanding, how you design tables, how you use them. That knowledge has really helped me in Android development and things like that. Other web-based stuff. I know that there exists a really good site for learning JavaScript now, because modern JavaScript is nothing like the JavaScript I learned mid-2000s, when Ajax was becoming a new thing, basically. So, late aughts, I guess. So, yeah. Now you have libraries like React and you can code backend with Node with JavaScript. So, but for web stuff, it's definitely W3 Schools, and then for programming languages like this, where you come down here. Let's go back. Where you can try a bunch of different languages like this. No, honestly, the 3 that I would recommend are HackerRank and LeetCode are the 2 that I'm personally familiar with, and the third one is this JDoodle. Seems really good at having an editor, but it doesn't provide questions. As long as I guess there are some assignments and stuff like that. So maybe explore through here. Oh, this might be self-made assignments by faculty like myself. Which isn't a bad idea. I might look into that. But yeah, LeetCode. LEET code. And then HackerRank. Those are the 2 big ones. And nowadays with remote work, or at least remote applications, I would bet most job interviews are going to start with at least one of HackerRank or LeetCode question for like an hour or so, just to prove that you're not completely BSing your skill set. And unfortunately, there's a book, Cracking the Coding Interview, I think is the title. I might be off it slightly. That talks about how the big companies, Google, Facebook, Amazon, etc., are fine with false negatives, meaning that if a potentially good employee doesn't get through the interview process, they're fine with that. And that's unfortunately the nature of their screening process. And so they start off with problems like this. Back in the day when Facebook was an exclusive site only for people in colleges, they had a training website like this for languages too. They've done away with that a long time ago, as far as I know. So, any other questions? Today's just really sort of a wrap up and finish the basic factory. We covered builder, factory, and abstract factory. Those are really the 3 biggest creational patterns I wanted to talk about. So, pull up the Wikipedia here. Oh, prototype and singleton. We'll skip those for now. Next, I want to start talking about some of the structural patterns. First two are the easiest. Well, the first one, adapter, is the easiest pattern there is, to be honest, in my opinion. So, there we go. What I'll do is I will create a new instance of this. And we'll start over. Sorry, lost my thought there for a second entirely. Oh. Okay. So, yeah. No, I always have weird typos like that when I'm trying to think. Problem is, I'm trying to think a couple steps ahead when I'm typing, and also trying to talk to you guys, and so it's all just a jumble, unfortunately. So let's look at this, and here's a perfect example. I actually like calling the adapter pattern the wrapper pattern because it makes a whole lot more sense. Now, notice you can't just type class there, because class is a reserved word in the Java language, so you can type. So we're creating a getter method here. Now, here's what's interesting. Execute this. Where am I? 24. Ah, 28. Return. Okay. I'm trying to rush too fast to make sure we get everything done in class. That's one of the problems with this type of development is I don't already have it typed out. So little things like that, like, oh yeah, you need a return statement. That's obvious. I've also been learning Kotlin, which you don't need the return statement. So, in certain cases. So it's interesting from my perspective. But anyways, so we can come up here and say, run this, make sure spelling is correct. Okay. Notice old class had a default constructor, but old class adapter does not. So you have to pass in a parameter. It's going to run, should just have a black output. Let's see. Non-static variable up. There we go. So the reason it couldn't access old class is because old class adapter is because old class adapter wasn't in the static scope. And then same, you needed to make old class static so that old class adapter would be able to instantiate it. There we go. So what we're seeing here is that there's an old class here, hence the name old class, and it had some methods, and we want to wrap them with a new class. Well, why would we want to do that? Well, this is a somewhat silly example, but let's pretend you're using a library, and that library is for creating windows on the screen. And that library has like 1,000 methods that you need to call in different orders to do different things. If you want rounded corners, you want bold yellow outline around your rounded corners. There's all these variables you got to set. Well, maybe you don't want to do that. Maybe you just want to say public whatever, let's just call it view. Let's pretend it's Android. Get my special window. And you'll do all those settings that you want in here, and you'll return that special window that you wanted, and then you'll be able to interact with it. Does that make sense? So you're wrapping an older class, and the wrapper simplifies the accessing of the old class. Now, that might be a little silly when you have the source code to this, and you could just change that, because let's see, you could just change this and add a get value here and just return old value directly. That makes sense, doesn't it? Can anybody think of a scenario where I wouldn't be able to do that? You might not have ran into it yet. You might not have thought of it. But there's a lot of scenarios and a lot of use cases where you're not going to be able to edit the code of the library you're using. So you have this class somewhere in the code that you're using for something. Let's say it's networking. It's the OK HTTP library, or it's the retrofit library, or it's some other library for networking, or dependency injection, Coin, or Hilt, or Dagger2, etc. And you don't like the exact interface of the class that it gives you. You can wrap it in a simple wrapper or adapter class and give it a new interface, give it some new methods. Newer languages like Kotlin have things that simplify this sort of, where you can just add a method to a class, but that doesn't work always the way you would want it to. So you would still need to know how to use this adapter pattern. Does that make sense? The pattern was originally named adapter, but I like the more modern naming of wrapper, because you're wrapping the older class and giving it new options, aka adapting it. I see where the name comes from, obviously, but personal preference. And you'll often see adapter versus wrapper interchange. So you need to know they're the same thing. And I personally would have called bridge the adapter pattern, but I didn't. I wasn't writing academic papers in the mid to early 90s, so I didn't get that chance. It's a little early. I don't think I'm going to have time to get into the next topic, so I will go ahead and leave it here. And if you want, in the class server under, what did I call it? Recommended books. I've listed a bunch of books that you might be interested in. Let's see, design patterns, pattern oriented software architecture, the POSA pattern oriented software architecture. Those books, there's 5, I believe, right now. I think they might be working on a 6th, but I'm not positive how that's coming along. 97 things every Java developer should know. Excuse me, hiccups. That's a relatively new book. I believe it just came out. 97 things that every developer should know. I think that's like 10 years old, but still very useful. And there's those 97 books. That's a series of books also. So there's one for like SQL, Ruby, whatever. So let me get back to the class discussion channel and see if anybody has any questions. All right. Does anybody have any questions in general? I think we're making really good progress, honestly, learning these patterns. I think you guys, or you all, habit is so hard to kill. I think you are all making really good progress in understanding these patterns. It's a little slow going, I know that, but actually working them through, showing how and why they're built, is, I think, one of the key reasons why or how to enable you guys to be, God, I did it again, good software developers here, starting now and going down the road. Because understanding why the patterns exist, like adapter. Oh, I'm not always going to be able to edit the source code of the classes I'm using, and maybe I want to write convenience methods for this class. Like, yeah, I can go ahead and curate some practice assignments for you on those sites. That's not a problem. I don't know if I'm going to make that the first assignment. I am going to be working on that stuff here shortly to provide you guidance on how the rest of the class will go. In a couple weeks, we're supposed to have our first test, but I do want to get you guys proper quizzes before then so that you're familiar with the format and won't be out of the blue. Do make sure that you've read up to chapters 1 through 5 by the end of this week. If you have any questions, you have to ask me. So, I'll probably next class or two, we're going to skip on the hands-on learning like this, and we're going to flip through the book and make sure everybody is solid on these principles of like the basic language features and things like that, and then we'll move forward. So I don't want to leave it up to you all completely to learn the language features. So we'll see how that goes. Like that, and then we'll prepare for first assignments and things like that. But if you can do what I'm doing on JDoodle, or you're going through HackerRank, and if you can do the HackerRank, algorithms, problem solving. Yeah, if you can do these, and maybe I might make these the assignment. If you can get all of these solved, you'll be solid. We'll put it that way. And these aren't that difficult. The concepts of inheritance and things like that we've covered are only going to make the basics of these very, very simple for you. So I think I'll go through these. I just skipped them, to be honest. I didn't need to do the loops, but yeah, I'll take a look at see if these might be decent assignments. The data structure stuff. This is the type of things that you're going to have to solve in data structures, first of all. But mainly, biggest hurdles are coding interviews, the coding portion of the interview. So, and then other things like that. Yeah, just have all these done by next week. You'll be fine. No, I'm kidding, obviously. But yeah, I'll go ahead and curate some of these. Honestly, really, you should be able to get all of these done. The Java basic. These are not difficult, and as you do them, you'll learn a lot. maybe some of them, like these, might not be needed. I would say easy. Yeah, I would try to do these. No, the bit set stuff. That's useful, but you don't need to know it now. But yeah, I'll look through all these. Don't worry. But I would get started on HackerRank and just start like the basic, easy ones and just going down the list. Definitely, yeah, all of these should be fairly straightforward. The 2D array might be a little more difficult for you if you hadn't had data structures yet, but give it a try. But yeah, that's what I would start with for actual hands-on stuff, because this is more experiential hands-on than it is purely lecture. And this course is technically a lecture course, so which I've tried to lean away from and leave the book reading to you and showing more hands-on stuff so that you can grasp why you write these things the way you do. So we have about 10 minutes left in class. I will go ahead and say we can end here, and if there's any further questions, I'll be available. I might end the stream and just answer in chat if anybody wants. I know some people find that easier. And then we'll go from there. Any questions before we do that? I don't see any. So yeah, we'll go ahead and just end it here. I'll go ahead and start preparing some of the rest of the course more concretely. I'm not like it's not that I haven't been preparing the course, it's that I have been trying to not overburden you all with, there's a lot of things that we could do. Like the composite pattern or the component pattern are just, in my opinion, they can be like brain exploding until you get it. Then once you get it, it's like a eureka moment. So I've been trying to pick and choose what type of topics we're covering so as not to overload you all. See, I remembered you all. All right, we'll go ahead and stop there for now. And I'll be available in chat for a little while if you have any questions. If you want to PM me direct questions, you're more than welcome. Otherwise, y'all come back now here, and you might not even get that reference, but there we go. Have a good night.